of the NACWA Pretreatment virtual event. Today's webinar is Pretreatment for PFAS on the Horizon. I am Cynthia Finley, Director of Regulatory Affairs for NACWA. Other NACWA staff assisting with the webinar today are Toby Watkins, NACWA Government Affairs Manager, and Gunnar Gehrman, Chief Information Officer. Before we introduce our speakers, I want to point out a few important features on your screen. For those of you who were with us for the webinar yesterday, welcome back. Today's webinar will be following the same format as yesterday's. All participants are muted, but we strongly encourage your participation via Q&A. The Q&A icon is located near the bottom of your webinar screen in the toolbar. We will address questions after all of our speaker presentations, but please submit any questions or comments throughout the webinar. You can also use the Q&A feature to report any technical difficulties. Although you may see a chat icon, the chat feature has been disabled for today's broadcast. If audio quality is an issue, backup dial-in numbers were provided in the confirmation email that you received. A link to the webinar recording and slide deck will be emailed to all participants tomorrow for both today's and yesterday's webinars. Before we get started, NACWA would like to recognize all of its all-conference sponsors who have continued their generous support of the association as we've moved to these online events rather than our in-person meetings. Thank you to our Clean Water Champion sponsors, our Clean Water Steward sponsors, and our Clean Water Protector sponsors. We appreciate all of you for your ongoing commitment to the association and our programming. I would now like to introduce the chair of NACWA's Pretreatment and Pollution Prevention Committee, Frank Dick. Frank is the wastewater engineering supervisor at the City of Vancouver, Washington, and Frank will be one of our moderators today. Frank, go ahead.
Hi there, everyone. Welcome everybody who has joined us this afternoon and this morning for those of us on the West Coast. This pretreatment virtual event is being held in lieu of NACWA's annual pretreatment workshop, plus the one-day training event, which was to happen in Nashville this week. It's been canceled due to the coronavirus pandemic. We are planning to meet in person next year in Nashville at around this time in May. So keep your eyes out for announcements later this year and start planning for it. Since we couldn't meet in person this week, we are using these webinars.
I just opened it up.
To help keep you informed about some of the current pretreatment hot topics. Yesterday, we heard updates from EPA, and tomorrow we will have a NACWA Pretreatment and Pollution Prevention Committee meeting to discuss current pretreatment issues. This committee meeting will be for NACWA members only. Please contact Cynthia if you are a NACWA member and need the information for the meeting. I would like to now introduce the Vice Chair of the NACWA Pretreatment and Pollution Prevention Committee, Carrie Brett. Carrie is the Pretreatment Manager at Narragansett Bay Commission in Providence, Rhode Island. Carrie.
Thanks, Frank. I'd like to also welcome you everybody to this webinar today. As Frank had said, we had planned to be in Nashville this week for the pretreatment workshop. We know that everybody was really looking forward to that location, so we are planning on having that workshop there next year. We have a great lineup of speakers today to talk about PFAS, which has been one of the hottest topics related to clean water over the last couple of years. I encourage you to enter your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of your screen throughout the webinar. Yesterday, we had over 50 questions submitted during the webinar, and we should have plenty of time again for questions and speakers to answer them. Our speakers today will be Carla Davidson from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, who will provide us with a state regulator's perspective. Steve Koplicki from the Great Lakes Water Authority and Kurt Anderson from the City of Grand Rapids, who will talk about their utilities PFAS work. Jeff McBurney from Casella Organics to discuss the situation in Maine and how it has impacted the POTWs there. We also have Jared Boschkel of the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, who will discuss developments in California. And our final speaker will be Emily Remmel from NACWA, who will give us a federal outlook for PFAS. We'll begin now with Carla Davidson. Carla?
Thank you. I'm Carla Davidson. I'm one of 3 regional IPP specialists in Michigan. And Ann Cavalier, my colleague, is also here to help answer questions. And this presentation is to share information about the Michigan's IPP initiative and our findings so far. And you'll hear more from Steve and Kurt about their cities programs, but I'll be talking about Michigan's statewide effort. And I wanted to emphasize that the IPP PFAS initiative that I'll talk about today is just one of a number of efforts that the state of Michigan is doing to address PFAS. And okay, so what are PFAS? PFAS are a class of synthetic chemicals. They are not naturally occurring. We've used them extensively over the past 70 years. Some have special properties like being resistant to both water and oil that have made them very useful in manufacturing commercial products. They are considered emerging pollutants, so the science about the impacts and the nature of the chemicals is still being developed. So there's a lot that we don't know yet. In Michigan, the PFAS of concern for surface waters, which is what I'll be talking about today, is PFOS, or perfluorooctane sulfonate, and PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid. We are concerned about PFAS for a number of reasons. PFAS are widespread in the environment and they don't break down easily. They are bioaccumulative and they may build up in our body tissue and tissues of fish and other organisms. Studies primarily with PFOA and PFOS show health effects from ingestion, such as lower birth weight, immune system effects, liver and thyroid damage, and kidney and testicular cancer. Nationally and internationally, POTWs have been found to be associated with PFAS detected in drinking water. In a study published by the American Chemical Society, PFOS and PFOA was found greater than the EPA lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion in drinking water sources, public drinking water sources for 6 million US residents. In this broad brush study, they looked at a variety of potential predictors of contaminated water supplies, and they found that the number of PFOS, PFOA manufacturers, military fire training areas, and wastewater treatment plants in watersheds were significant predictors of PFAS detection in public water supplies. PFOS and PFOA are the 2 PFAS that currently have water quality standards in Michigan, which is why we're focused on these pollutants. These standards were developed in 2014 and 2011, respectively. And this table shows the various criteria that we use to develop our water quality standards. The criteria on the right are protective of aquatic life. Those on the left are protective of humans eating the fish. And as you can see, the criteria protecting humans are much more stringent than those protecting the fish. And the surface water criteria are so low due to the bioaccumulative nature of PFAS and fish. Michigan does have fish consumption advisories that are driven by PFOS, PFOS. We are using an existing regulatory program, NPDES, to address new pollutants. For wastewater treatment plants with IPPs, we are requiring source evaluation and follow-up to ensure that wastewater treatment plants do not pass through PFOS or PFOA greater than water quality standards to surface water, or accept PFOS or PFOA in quantities that would interfere with the management of biosolids. And this is a current permit requirement, but for new pollutants. And you can see here, there are a number of potential approaches to addressing pass-through of pollutants to waters of the state from wastewater treatment plants. But we chose to focus on finding sources rather than first screening the wastewater treatment plant effluent, because we were concerned that we would miss sources due to the dilution of wastewaters or the intermittent nature of some discharge. And it's generally more effective to eliminate and treat at the lower volume concentrated source rather than at the wastewater treatment plant effluent, which is higher volume and more dilute. Oh, shoot. And I'm sorry, I'm a little. Lost my way here. The IPP, there we go. The IPP PFAS initiative, so sorry, was first started in February of 2018. We required wastewater treatment plants with required IPP programs to look for sources of PFAS in their systems. The wastewater treatment plants were required to evaluate industrial users and other sources, such as contaminated sites, as potential sources of PFAS. Conduct follow-up sampling of probable sources and sample wastewater treatment plant effluent if sources were above the screening criteria of 12 parts per trillion PFOS. None of our treatment plants found PFOA above water quality standards. So all the wastewater treatment plants have their reports in, and there is more information about the initiative at the website that you see there. In terms of the sources of PFAS that we found in Michigan, the largest source that we found were chrome platers. There's also some metal finishers that use a chromate conversion coating as part of their process, typically aluminum anodizers, and those were also sources, but much less concentrations of PFAS. And it's important to note that fume suppressants containing PFAS were banned in 2015, and none of the platers that we've identified were currently using any products that contained PFOS. The fume suppressants were used historically to control fumes, primarily those from hexavalent chromium, to protect worker health and safety and meet air quality standards. And so this appears to be primarily a legacy issue with the platers. If they used PFAS in the past as a fume suppressant, they still have it in their effluent. We found a number of other sources of PFAS in Michigan, including contaminated sites, such as former metal finishers, AFFF use, paper manufacturing, chemical manufacturing, some with multiple or unknown sources, landfill leachate, centralized waste treaters, AFFF contaminated drains and sewers, chemical manufacturers, and to a small extent, industrial laundries. So this figure describes our bin process, which followed data clusters as we saw them initially, and was a way for us to prioritize wastewater treatment plants and organize our response. So we ended up with 44 of our 95 wastewater treatment plants with IPPs finding no sources. So those are the bin 1 in blue. 22 found sources, but their own effluent met our water quality standards, and those are the bin 2 in yellow. And 29 found sources and wastewater treatment plant effluent exceeded Michigan's water quality standards. Those are our bin 3 in the red. And then we divided that bin into 2 bins, one with greater than or equal to 50 parts per billion in bin 3B, and those with less than 50 parts per, oh, I said billion, I meant trillion, sorry, less than 50 parts per trillion PFOS in bin 3A. And another way to look at it is in this pie chart, we're showing that 46% found no sources in the blue, 23% had at least one source but met water quality standards in yellow, and 31% found sources and exceeded water quality standards at least once in red. So we asked wastewater treatment plants with sources to require source control. Cleaning and replacing equipment has led to some reductions, especially for smaller amounts or isolated sources, but it's generally not been that successful on its own if there was a lot of contamination and it was widespread. For treatment at sources, the tried and true method is granulated activated carbon, or GAC, and we've seen significant reductions, although there are cost and maintenance issues. Resin has been used at a couple of facilities I know as polishing after GAC, but I think both the cost, because it's more expensive than GAC, and maintenance issues, since it'll start discharging more than it takes in if it's not maintained, have led some companies to abandon it. And I wanted to show you one of my facilities. This is a small wastewater treatment plant that had an intermittent source of PFAS. It was a chrome plater, and after they installed pretreatment, the wastewater treatment plant's effluent has been meeting water quality standards since August of 2018. And overall, the IPP PFAS initiative in Michigan has been a success with significant reductions in PFAS discharge from wastewater treatment plants. You can see here that a number of wastewater treatment plants have had significant reductions in their effluent. 8 wastewater treatment plants with over 90% reduction, primarily due to the installation of pretreatment at sources. 6 of the top 7 wastewater treatment plants on this list had a single source, so all chrome platers. And when PFAS pretreatment was added, the PFAS in their effluent was reduced substantially, and that was pretreatment at the source. Sources installing pretreatment include chrome platers, contaminated sites, landfilled, combined wastewater treatment facilities, and in one case, replacement of a contaminated drinking water source contributed to PFAS reduction in the wastewater treatment plant's effluent. Although initial efforts are complete for the IPP initiative, we've set up ongoing requirements, including ongoing wastewater treatment plant effluent PFAS sampling and status reports, with the frequency of that depending on the bin. And we're asking wastewater treatment plants to work with sources to reduce and eliminate PFAS, and recommending that wastewater treatment plants develop local regulatory controls like local limits and reduction plans. Although initial efforts are complete for the IPP initiative, we have set up ongoing requirements, including ongoing wastewater treatment plant effluent sampling for PFAS and status reports with the frequency depending on the bin. Oh, I'm sorry. So we will be setting up NPDES requirements in the permit. So ongoing, sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulties here. PFAS, PFOA monitoring will be part of the permit, and there will also be minimization plans for PFAS and PFOA. The municipal NPDES permits issued after October 1st, 2021 will specify effluent limits for PFAS and PFOA if the POTW effluent has the potential to exceed water quality standards. For more information about the initiative, as well as updates, you can go to the MPART webpage and click on the testing menu, then click on the wastewater treatment plant IPP section. You can click, there's a really nice interactive map here in the middle, and you can actually see the PFAS concentrations of the effluent. And the green dots here show wastewater treatment plants whose last effluent sample was less than water quality standards, with the black dots showing those greater than water quality standards. And there's a lot of information about the IPP initiative on the michigan.gov/IPP webpage as well. So there's letters, guidance materials, there's helpful links, such as a link to a training that we conducted. There's regional meeting information and a webinar that we all conducted to kick off the initiative. And then coming soon, we have a wastewater study summary where we'll talk about POTW effluent biosolids and biosolids field application data. We have an EPA Office of Research and Development fume suppressant study results that will be released soon. And there'll be more about our strategy for regulating PFAS from direct dischargers and industrial stormwater runoff as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla. We'll move directly to our next speaker, Stephen Kuplicki. Steve, are you ready?
I'm ready here. If you give me controls. Let's see, click to start. Okay. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Here to tell you about our efforts and progress in addressing PFAS and minimizing PFAS in the Great Lakes service area. For those that don't know, the Great Lakes Water Authority represents the city of Detroit and 76 other communities here in southeast Michigan. We're your typical 1 billion gallon a day facility. Let's see, okay. So, as you heard in the last presentation here, the state of Michigan sent us greetings back in 2018. And essentially with those greetings, they directed us to do certain things. Among those were to identify, classify sources of PFAS, to quantify these sources, and then to implement and enforce reduction elimination protocols on these sources in order to gain a handle on it. Now, the trick here was that, at least at the time, we were aware that PFAS as a group of compounds we looked at it, I guess, as a water issue primarily. We didn't really see a wastewater issue related to it. So it quickly became a wastewater issue. The only set of tools that we really knew we had available to us to address this was the pretreatment program. And again, pretreatment program has historically been used for implementing and enforcing pollutant controls. Other examples are under the 9 minimum CSO controls. IPP pretreatment programs are one of the possible solutions. And we've in the past had minimization of certain pollutants, primarily in this area, mercury and PCB, we've been implementing for over 30 years. And so we went back and we used the knowledge and history and experience we've gained in doing this to develop our answer in response to the pretreatment program. Okay, I'm not sure if I've got control here. Okay, next slide. So in laying out what our next steps were here, we put together basically a good 5-point action plan. Part of this was we knew we had to educate our leadership, because one of the biggest issues here was that up until then, we had no budget or really resources that we could identify or dedicate to investigation of PFAS. PFAS analysis wasn't cheap. It was anywhere from $400 to $500 per analysis at the time, excluding sample collection. While it's gone down since that time, it still is not a cheap commodity. We also recognize that our own analytical laboratory, which we use to, for most of our pretreatment program work, we do not perform high performance liquid chromatography, which is what you need to analyze PFAS compounds. So we had to use a contract laboratory. And we also recognize that there were special sampling protocols that we needed to either develop or pay someone else to do it on this. So again, we laid that out as issues and concerns to our leadership. Next, we recognized that there were information we lacked. Historically, we had never asked any of our industrial users about their use of PFAS. So our first step was we conducted an informational survey. We did this one to collect information on what did our users know, or at least our permitted users, about the use of PFAS while we endeavored to acquire and reassign our budget priorities to be able to get monitoring capabilities. If a person responded in the affirmative, or if they failed to respond to our notice and request for information, they were asked to conduct self-monitoring for PFAS compounds, of which in Michigan includes 24 compounds, specific compounds. We also developed our own independent monitoring program, because while we always look to the user as a first course of action to do self-monitoring. We wanted to have our own means to independently verify and assess what people were putting in. So we developed our own sampling protocols for sample collection. We trained our staff on how to collect PFAS samples, and we looked at analyses, and we selected the ASTM method D7979 as our predominant method. There is another method, US EPA method 537 modified. We didn't use that particularly, but that's just because of our laboratory that we worked with. In order to comply with state requirements, we classified our users and we notified them of what we thought were the next steps here. A user was classified as not being a source if they were found to be below the water quality standards for PFOS or PFOA. If we did find significant quantities of other PFAS compounds, one of the other 22, and those were at least, if they were at least equivalent to PFOA or greater, we asked them for more information. Otherwise, we concluded that the facility was not a source. And then we classified anyone as a source or a potential source if the data or their response to our surveys indicated they dealt with these materials or they were found to be at or above Michigan's water quality standards. And those were the drinking water standards. So it was 11 for PFOS and the 420 for PFOA. Additionally, as part of our response and plan, that we were going to look at source control, so we would direct our users to employ best management plans because treatment at our facility was not deemed feasible at the time. And we looked for the facilities to control via their source their discharges. And finally, we recognized that there needed to be some data collection at our wastewater recovery facility in order to assess what our contributions of these materials were to the environment. So during 2018 and 19, we made some progress in 18 in order to carry out our initial responsibilities. We surveyed our users. As I say, we sent surveys to about 300 of our users. We received answers and/or classified based on industry type about 138 possible sources, of which we required either self-monitoring or monitoring on our own part. Again, self-monitoring was approximately 40 samples were probably SIU samples, and the balance was our own independent samples, at least in 2018, for a total of 186 sample sets for PFAS compounds that were collected. We initiated quarterly monitoring at our wastewater recovery facility. During 2009, we, based on the information from 2018, we classified our sources and we required them to submit best management plans. We did this actually at the very end, December of 2018. We had an informational meeting. We notified them in writing of the need to develop a best management program. We gave them 90 days or to March 31st to submit a best management plan to us. Two of those, we identified as, say, 52 sources. Two of the plans received, they were really excellent. Very little comment was needed. We incorporated those directly into our permits. The remaining 50, well, I'll be polite. I'll say they needed some work. So we sought to decide that we would incorporate the BMP into a compliance agreement because we didn't feel it was adequate to just modify the permit and have them use that way. And again, in that compliance agreement, essentially the pattern we followed was we required everyone to review what raw materials and chemicals are you using, to at least give us that as a response, to do some additional baseline monitoring. Again, it varied based on the type of facility, to submit and detail their reduction, elimination, or control plan, what we call the REACT plan. And also that if you had more than 60 nanograms a liter or 2,300 nanograms a liter of PFOA, then you needed to definitely address treatment and treatment alternatives. If you were below those levels, you could address treatment, but we weren't looking necessarily for an answer there. And again, these were our preliminary numbers on a potential local limit if we had to do that. And that's where these numbers came from. I mean, they were just set up as preliminary values. They are not local limits. They were just used as a compliance level for getting people to respond to the question about treatment. And then we asked them to turn in a final report and update and revise their BMPs. And we gave almost all of them to November 2019. A few were given December of 2019. Again, based on these results, we reclassified 6 users from being a significant source to not a source, but we added 3 users as a significant source. Again, in 2019, we almost doubled the amount of sampling performed. 441 sample sets were performed. Again, approximately 160 of these were the authority samples, our own independent samples. The remainder were SIU sampling that was performed. And again, we either incorporated these BMPs as we received them after November into a wastewater discharge permit, or in some cases where there was a need for installation of additional treatment equipment, we issued a more detailed compliance agreement. Again, this is just a quick listing of our SIUs, the types that we addressed. Typical note, one of the things that wasn't mentioned, I think, in the state report were airfields. We have a commercial airfield. We have a military airfield. Again, the use is from AFFF foaming agents, and it's not so much based on actual events and episodes of fire. It predominantly comes from their training exercises that they employed the foaming materials. They were, let's just say, very liberal in how they applied and or used foams during these times. Again, another group, centralized waste treaters. We have a significant number of centralized waste treaters that service not only our service region, the state of Michigan, good part of Midwest, United States, and Canada. And again, just one other note here in the chart here about chemical producers. We have chemical producers, primarily those supporting the electroplating metal finishing industry. These are found to have materials that contain the PFAS compounds. One you can see here, it ranged to 4.3 million nanograms a liter. They had a rather large release. We'll talk about that in a minute. Otherwise, the list is consistent with what the state presented. Again, our treatment plant, we've been collecting data quarterly. You can see the spike in approximately August of 2019, which coincided with that 4.3 million release from the discharger from the chemical producer. Over time, we've seen a decrease. It did jump up again here late April, so we'll follow up. We are following up to see if there was a subsequent release to that. But PFOS is a parameter of concern. PFOA, we are extremely low. It's really not even approaching or of concern at this time for our facility. So again, our NPDES permit was reissued in July of 2019. We received a requirement to develop a PFOS and PFOA minimization program. We also included as a general criteria that be a PFAS compound program. Again, we laid out in there some of the lessons learned and improvements to how we were going to be identifying our users as potential sources. We put together a monitoring strategy both for our wastewater treatment facility, a 5-year plan, and for our users to employ both self-monitoring and our own control authority monitoring in that. And again, on new sources, we would determine what was appropriate based on the type of facility that they were. We also were in the process of making updates to our local rules at the time. So we've developed initial rules that have put this into legalese for source control. We basically have 3 groups of users who we call just general users who are our centralized waste treaters at landfills, and a 3rd group are people who are using firefighting foam and agents. And again, we also made a commitment that we would include PFAS compounds as a pollutant of concern in our next local limits evaluation study, which is due June of next year. So is it working? Good question. Essentially, for with the exception of the chemical manufacture and centralized waste treatment facilities, we've actually observed a substantial reduction at essentially 42 of the sources that we are regulating currently under this program. Our centralized waste treaters, again, they are receiving increased quantities of materials laden with PFAS. They are either installing or planning to install additional treatment. Where there's additional treatment being installed, we're requiring at least some type of interim short-term treatment to be provided in order to mitigate their acceptance of these materials. Our discussions with landfills, I'll just say it's progressing slowly. Across the state, we've seen equivalent levels and concentrations and longer-term solutions for AFFF products. And then finally, just finally here, again, we're seeing progress from what we started in 2018. I guess we'll continue to do this and just carry through with our minimization program. With that, I'll turn it over to Kurt.
Thank you, Stephen. Next, we do have Kurt Anderson from the great city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Are you ready, Kurt?
I am ready. So welcome and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to NACWA for putting on this webinar to discuss at least our favorite topic here in Michigan for the past couple years. And it is could soon be your favorite topic as well. And over the course of my time here, I want to share and hopefully share some information with you that you find helpful if you are just beginning to address PFAS in your IPP program, or if you are just hearing about PFAS for the first time. And I'm going to focus on our PFAS journey here in Grand Rapids, and specifically kind of where we're at now, the journey a little bit, and the main component I want to talk about is what we have learned through this process while working with our industries. So here is some general plant information. We are not a billion-gallon plant like GLWA, a little bit smaller, so you've got some economies of scale there. But this will give you an idea of the size of our plants and of our IPP program with the SIUs that we have permitted. And on the right side, there's a graph that has our PFOS and PFOA effluent averages since we started sampling in September of 2018. And there should be one point in the graph that should be grabbing your attention immediately, because when we got the sample results back from this, it definitely grabbed our attention. So we've been bobbing along under 50 nanograms per liter. And in August 2019, which is kind of ironic because GLWA had a spike at the same time, we hit 360 nanograms per liter. And we were just kind of in shock first of like, what happened here? So this actually became a lesson for us. And when we did some digging, this is what we found out. So prior to collecting our sample, which we normally collect in the morning, prior to that, our plant operations, they were doing preventative maintenance on tanks and actually had our plant flow diverted to an on-site retention basin for like 4 hours. So prior to us taking this sample, they restored the plant flow about an hour before this. So we didn't have any clue what they were doing. So what we suspect happened is while they were taking tanks down and diverting flow, that some of the PFOS was released from the biosolids because of it and caused this spike. Because as you can see from the graph, we didn't have anything near close to that prior to or even after that event. So this was one of the lessons that we learned here at the plant, is make sure that you coordinate with your operations staff to see what they have going on prior to any sampling. You know, with all these sample points, we want to make sure that we have normal plant flows. So when we are evaluating how things are working and what our results are, we can kind of compare apples to apples. So this is our path that we have been on since February 2018. This is actually a compacted version of all the actions that we have taken to address PFAS. As you can see, it's a marathon, and it's definitely not a sprint. It tends to be a little bit of a winding road that has multiple plan components to it, each that have differing levels of difficulty to address and to implement. And this is actually our second generation path, is what I call it. The initial one we had was just 2018 through 2019, and that was full, just like this one is. So just something to realize as you're either starting or working through PFAS is it's going to take quite a bit of time to start and navigate your way through it. So now that we are in 2020, we have some expectations for our PFAS program. And the biggest one is we have 5 industries that are scheduled to install pretreatment this year. And we also are trying to get our bin reclassification. Carla spoke about that. And what that would do is our sampling frequency now on our effluent is monthly. So we have an inspection team that goes out and dons all the gear and does all the decontamination and collects samples throughout our plant. So if we can have our bin reclassified, we don't have to sample as much. And obviously the ultimate goal is having effluent PFOS below 12 nanograms per liter. We all know that because of COVID, delays with essential facilities, and we've had some industries shut down, some metal finishers, so that's gonna add some months to their plan to get pilot programs and to get these installations, these treatment systems installed. So we'll see as time goes on how much of a delay that's going to be. And as far as looking ahead to 2021, I'm not sure what kind of new regulations that are going to be in place, or new rules, or even new limits. So this is definitely something that's going to go on for quite some time. So our process began when we developed a rough draft of how we were going to address PFAS. And what we did with that plan is we actually provided it to our local surface finisher chapter president for review and feedback, to discuss with them what the industry's concerns were going to be, and what our plan consisted of, and if they had issues or could tell us some of the concerns they have. And that was very helpful to end up crafting what our future meetings with our industries looked like. So we could take their feedback and we could highlight their concerns and address them at our meeting. And our initial meeting that we had actually had this slide on it as a kind of a big picture item of how we're going to do things. And we met with our tier 1 probable sources. We broke our SIUs into tiers, and we walked them through and explained what our plan looked like. And if and when you do this, you're going to expect, you need to expect a lot of questions, basically in general and regarding PFAS. Because basically, when we were doing this, we turned out to be, educating the industries on this new parameter, and what information was out there at the time was kind of interesting because we were kind of learning right along with them and sharing as much information as possible. Fortunately, now there's a host of resources available for both the industries that you're working with and your program to educate yourself on PFAS. So these are not problems per se, but these are some of the main things that we've noticed while working directly with facilities. And after we had our initial meetings, we actually met with them one-on-one and discussed how this is going to work. And this facility plan development, that takes quite a bit of time because the industry has to work on how they're going to reduce and eliminate PFAS. And the big takeaway here would be to provide as much guidance to the industry as you can. And how we handled that was we developed a flow chart that we brought to the meetings with us that laid out what the industry's responsibilities are, what our expectations were going to be, any timelines that we had, and sampling and reporting frequencies. And that was very handy to have at these meetings because, I mean, there were a lot of questions, and they have a lot of questions on, well, how do we even start? And what level do you want us to treat to? And what treatment options are even out there for this? So that was helpful when we provided that. And once they saw that, they could at least provide some better timelines when they understood the scope of what we were asking them to do. Sampling and laboratory, this was another big issue that came up. And the main question we got, besides what method can we use for analysis, because there is no EPA approved method, that came up constantly. But the next question was, well, what lab do you recommend? And as a general IPP practice, we don't recommend laboratories. So what we did is we told them how we selected our laboratory, and that was through the Department of Defense as a website that has certified labs on there to DoD standards for parameters and methods that are used. And that was a place that they could start to do that. And the issue that we had as well in early 2018 and 2019 was turnaround time from industries, from laboratories, because there was just a flood of municipalities and industries wanting sample results. So the turnaround time went from 2 weeks to 3 weeks to a month. So that caused some delays with receiving that information back and then addressing things. Another issue we had for sampling was we've had some industries that took samples and they were above the water quality standard. Then they would resample and it would be non-detect and it would be under the water quality samples. So I would suggest that you have a program in place to address that. We set a certain number of resamples to address that, but that is something that is definitely going to come up. And pilot testing, this has been interesting because the industries have noticed some treatment challenges while they're doing this. And the main couple are backwash frequency and volume of water, as well as breakthrough. They're working on that because they want to size their full-size treatment system correctly. So they have issues with how to address that and how often that happens. And there also were issues with polymer that was causing like a film layer that was reducing flow, as well as some iron precipitation that was plugging up some pre-filters that they had. So the industries have to work through that. So those are something that you need to be aware of that is going to happen. And installation does take some time. So this is our progress for 2020. Our PFOS results have been below 50 nanograms per liter. 3 out of the 4 have been below 20. So we are excited about that. That's encouraging. And, you know, as I said, we have 5 industries that are going to install treatment this year. So we anticipate that our effluent PFOS is going to continue to drop. So with that, I will send it back to Frank or Carrie.
All right, thank you, Kurt. Hey, as a reminder, we will do questions for all of the speakers at the end here. So please continue to enter your questions into that Q&A box. So let's move on to our next speaker, Jeff McBurney, and I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thanks for spending a few minutes with, as Kurt said, everyone's favorite topic, PFAS. At least it was pre-COVID. I'm going to have a little bit different perspective because in Maine, the focus initially was on the biosolids, but I will try to bring it back around at the end to discuss a little bit about the impacts of the wastewater treatment and pre-treatment. Obviously, for my organization, biosolids is a very important focus in that we are the largest composter of biosolids in the region at over 40,000 tons a year. And we manage throughout the North Atlantic several 100,000 tons of biosolids. So it certainly is something that we're trying to get our minds around. So just quick background, this is not a new topic for Casella. It's kind of been on our radar for quite a few years. And it came to a head back in 2017, 2018, when the Maine DEP changed their rules on the beneficial use of solid waste by updating a table that included some screening levels for PFAS, not to be applied to biosolids, but their potential was there. So we had our reservations about this, and we testified at the legislature that we are not entirely satisfied with the risk assessment model used. In fact, they used a petroleum leaching model, which is really not appropriate for modeling the release of chemicals from an organic compound or organic matrix like biosolids. And as Kurt mentioned, there were no certified methods for testing solids, only for drinking water. So that was our concern we had. During the drinking water program, US EPA's drinking water unregulated contaminants monitoring rule, phase 3, there was some PFAS found in the Maine public water system. It was below the lifetime health advisory, but it was enough to raise people's awareness and attention. The source was identified as a farm that had utilized industrial residuals from paper mills in the 80s and biosolids in the 90s. The farm essentially initiated a lawsuit against the chemical manufacturers of the PFAS compounds, and also 2 of the wastewater treatment facilities that have utilize the lands for recycling biosolids. That lawsuit kind of drugged for a while and wasn't really gaining traction. So they held a press conference on the farm, and that basically touched off the firestorm in Maine. Simultaneously, the governor of Maine had created a PFAS task force to start to look at this, which was probably the appropriate pathway to take. So fast forward, essentially a couple weeks later, I get a call in my office that basically we're being told that there's going to be a formal announcement and that there are going to be some formal actions taken regarding the utilization and distribution of biosolids. So after that call, the actual notice went out to processors like Casella and also generators. And when I use the term generator, I'm referring to the wastewater treatment facilities that produce the biosolids. And essentially, that notice went public with a press release. And of course, this was a Friday afternoon, and basically all we could do for the weekend was stew about it. So the details, and I'll get to more later. I'll leave the slide up for just a few seconds, but I will be discussing most of these points later. There was basically a moratorium on the distribution and utilization of biosolids. A couple weeks later, similar notification went out to holders of what we call a program approval, which is just basically permission to utilize residuals or biosolids agronomically. They received a similar notice to suspend distribution of their materials. So in essence, what we were required to do, as I previously mentioned, was stop deliveries and utilization. So for our compost facility, we ship bulk loads out of our facility, but we also have a lot of walk-in customers. So we were basically required to suspend all those operations. Now this is simply and strictly for in-state customers, so we were allowed to move a little bit of material to other states. However, that was not really sufficient to manage what we had to manage. We did, along with one of our industry trade groups, request meetings with the DEP commissioner, which we held. And unfortunately, they did not change the situation anyway. They understood our concerns, but it was basically, please follow through with the requirements of the moratorium. So as part of that, we were required to update our sampling and analysis work plans to include the testing for PFAS, basically 3 compounds, PFOA, PFOS, and PFBS. We did collect samples and had them tested by labs that have been approved by the department, and we submitted those results. Now, I'm not going to say we were total geniuses in this, but we did get lucky in that some of our surrounding states had taken a more proactive approach and had actually started sampling materials and actually a broader spectrum of materials than the state of Maine is testing. And so as part of that, the state of New Hampshire actually came and collected our compost samples and tested them for us because we distribute in New Hampshire. So we had data in front of this. So that was actually kind of helpful for us. Overall, through all the testing, we found very few entities that saw no disruption. And when I say that, basically most of the results came back with 1 or 2 of the screening levels for the PFOA or the PFOS exceeded, which meant before you could resume business, you had to come up with a certain best management practice, which usually was a reduction of application rates. So for some businesses like us, we were back in operation within 2 or 3 weeks. Others, it was 2 or 3 months. For some of our direct land application programs, those were either suspended completely or scaled back significantly because as part of that, the so-called screening levels that applied to the biosolids actually became ceiling limits for soils to which they were applied. So if you did a soil test, and they exceeded these screening levels, basically those sites were suspended for recycling. Well, the timing couldn't have been worse. Inventories this time of year are at its peak, and personally, we were ready to ship significant volumes. April and May are our largest shipping months. So our inventories were at peak. And unfortunately, like wastewater, biosolids don't stop coming. They're produced every day and they have to be managed every day. And not just in Maine, but region-wide, there are not a lot of options for disposal. Landfill is kind of complicated. It's not just airspace. And in our region, very little incineration is available. So this is Hawk Ridge, where we produce our material. This is the problem. We typically don't store our materials in these big block piles. We usually like to have them in windrows. And because of the backlog and the inability to ship, we were forced to manage it this way. So the current status is right now, it's basically, we're continuing as before, testing materials, although the frequency on finished products like compost have been doubled to 2 times a year instead of once annually. We're still comparing them to screening levels, which we don't believe are appropriate. Again, we're still doing risk determinations and applying DMPs. The original order was for 1 year, ending this June 30th. But with the new review, based on all the data that the DEP has received and additional testing they've done, as well as our drinking water program, they basically set pretty much the same program in perpetuity until more data is collected and they find reasons to either reduce the severity or increase the amount of oversight. So we did have a task force, as I said, and ultimately the mission was to identify the extent of exposure in Maine, which makes sense, examine what risk there were to Maine residents and the environment, and make recommendations for approaches that would most effectively address the risks. And unfortunately, the moratorium happened before the task force concluded its work. There was some implementation going on while the task force was in progress, as well as after the report was finalized and delivered to the governor. And unfortunately, like a lot of things, the attention of a lot of people has been shifted from PFAS to COVID-19. We still are moving forward, but it's a lot slower pace. There's the report. If you go to Maine DEP website, you can get a copy of that if you'd like to look at that. And so to speak to wastewater, there's been really no discussion on wastewater treatment discharge, although it did come up kind of as almost an aside in the context of the task force. Some utilities have been investigating independently because they do want to know what the potential sources are and try to establish background levels or trends. You know, obviously we want to push this as far upstream as possible because once it's in the biosolids, there is no treatment process for it there. So some of the considerations right now, prior to having a lot more data on the wastewater discharges, is considering stopping the receipt of septage and landfill leachate because there are concerns that those are big sources, although there is some contention that for at least the leachate, that may not be a big source as we think. And what we're finding in general in the biosolids that it's household utilization, coming in from the dust and things that are washed out of the houses and in laundry and things like that. So again, there will eventually be some impact to pretreatment in Maine, but that's been kind of an afterthought for the current way of thinking. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done. As I've mentioned, we're not convinced of the risk assessments and the fate and transport modeling. There's a lot of work going on nationwide. We still don't have certified methods other than drinking water, and we haven't seen the EPA release the MCLs, although there's talk of it. The concern there is the drinking water MCLs is really what's going to drive the land application screening levels. So if those go lower than the 70, that could be a major impact, and again, another impact to an outlet for biosolids recycling. And again, there has been regulatory and legislative action going on for the last couple of years, again, halted or slowed by the COVID-19. So I'll basically you know, I suspect that we are going to see some more a higher level of regulation, and that probably will be significant impacts to both the treatment of water and wastewater as far as infrastructure needs and just ongoing O&M expenses. There may be some soil remediation standards coming out. And again, there's a lot of discussion about considering these compounds under CERCLA, which on the surface seems like a great idea because, you know, we have monies available for remediation, but it does make water and wastewater utilities potentially responsible parties for which they could be ultimately financially responsible if there are no other parties to go after. And we've seen with other things like the opioid drugs, you can go bankrupt, still operate, and then you may be able to avoid litigation. So that is all I have, and I'm happy to turn it over to Jared. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. So yes, next we have Jared Bosco from California Association of Sanitation Agencies. So I'll turn it over to Jared.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all my co-panelists. I've learned a lot of information this afternoon. I'm Jared Vosco. I'm out here in California, and I wanted to share a little bit about our state's recent activity regarding PFAS. I'm trying to take control of the slides. There we go. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I'd like to share with you the California EPA's investigative plan, which was announced in March of last year. And then I'd like to show just some preliminary results from the first 2 phases of this plan. And then I'll end up with what their plans are for wastewater treatment plants in phase 3. So just for background, the State Water Resources Control Board in California is part of the California EPA. And at the State Water Board's meeting in March of 2019, partly in response to the perception that the US EPA wasn't going to be regulating PFAS, the State Water Board decided to kind of take their own actions and dealing with this issue. And so they announced a plan where they would require sampling and monitoring of PFAS in different locations. And so phase 1 entailed wells, drinking water wells, airports, and landfills. Phase 2 were chrome platers. And then they're working right now on phase 3 with wastewater treatment plants. What these orders, it's an executive order that's sent out to the recipients, and in there requires them to develop a work plan to submit to a regional water board that will approve it or request them to modify it. And then they have to test for anywhere between 23 to 39 different PFAS analytes, and then do this quarterly and then submit the results to the regional board, which makes it up to the state board. This is an interesting development for us because in addition to this plan, state has also lowered and dropped the notification levels and response levels in California for PFOA and PFAS. A notification level means you have to provide notice to your customers or your ratepayers that you had a finding or the detection that exceeded the notification level. And a response level means you have to take some type of action regarding that level. And particularly for PFAS, there was a bill last year, Assembly Bill 756 here in California, that requires an exceedance of the response level to take that drinking water well offline. And so you can see the NLs and the RLs there, but they're pretty low. Notification now for PFOA is 5.1 parts per trillion, and for PFAS it's 6.5 parts per trillion. But the response level is 10 parts per trillion for PFOA and 40 parts per trillion for PFAS, which are well below the US EPA guidelines. So during phase 1, drinking water wells, you can see a map here on the left of all the different sites they tested, and you can see the color coding of the dots. There were 584 wells that were below the notification level, 227 that were above the notification level but below the response level. And then there were some in the, it looks like 18 on the graph on the right that were above the response level, 13 of which were really high, over 100 parts per trillion. Interestingly, in Southern California, in Orange County, of the 200 wells in their system, approximately a third of them are exceeding the response level, and they've been taken out of offline and out of production which has had a huge impact on their water supply. And they're now having to import water in to help make up for that. And they've also initiated a pretty complex plan for remediating it over the next coming years so that they can get those wells back in production. Now, phase 2 of the state's plan, they sent it out to landfills and air porters and chrome platers, and you can see they're just getting these results in, but you can kind of see on the map all the different sites they tested. For our interest today with wastewater treatment plants, I thought I'd share with you their goal here and what they have in plans. We've been working with them, a group of our members across the state of regional associations in the Bay Area, the Central Valley, and Southern California, have been meeting in Sacramento with the state water board's investigators to try to develop the plan and for us to provide input on what's feasible for our members to conduct. We're expecting this plan to come out in the next few months at some time, but in our most recent conversations, the state had recognized that sampling at this time wouldn't result in data that's representative of typical conditions because of the impacts of COVID-19 and the different flows that are being sent through our facilities. And so it seems like they're willing to allow sampling to begin a little bit later than initially planned, but they are going to request that plants test quarterly effluent and biosolids. It's not a land application of the biosolids, it's just the actual biosolids itself. And then these samples have to be sent out to one of the 10 labs in California, even though that will analyze the sample despite that there's an approved method for these non-potable matrices. And the concern for us with this, at least, is the cost per treatment plant, which will be at least $20,000 annually, as well as the number of treatment plants they're looking at. And we're still working with them to winnow down that list. But as of right now, there looks to be at least over 300 people on their preliminary, 300 agencies on their preliminary list that they want to reach out to. So, you know, a cost like that would be $6 million. And with our state, we are having a projected $54 billion budget deficit in the coming year. And local cities and municipalities are projecting a $7 billion deficit. So, you know, for us, that cost is a concern, and we're hoping to work with them to find a solution that allows them to get the information and data they need, but not at the expense or the costs that potentially would be incurred, given that there's some comparability of data issues and also given the lack of an approved method. So we have a meeting later this month with the state board to see what their latest developments are on their plans, and I think we'll learn there far more details on how they're settling on this. And I'm sure that in the coming months, you'll see this plan as it's rolled out to the broader public. I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards in the Q&A section, and otherwise I'll hand it off to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. We'll turn to our last speaker, Emily Remmel with NACWA, and she'll give us some perspectives from the federal level. Emily.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Thank you everyone for sticking with us today. And I know we're running short on time a little bit, so I'm going to be brief and be pretty high level so we can get to the burning questions that you all have. The first thing I want to mention is that last year, NACWA did put out a resource. If you are just now beginning to look to source identification, pretreatment, and sampling protocols, NACWA has a considerations document on our website. You can also just Google NACWA PFAS considerations pretreatment, something like that, and you'll find it. It's also on the NACWA site. It leveraged a lot of the utility expertise. Stephen and Kurt, who you heard from earlier today, also contributed to that. So I would check out that resource if you're interested in wrapping your head around this issue a little further. As you all know, absent federal action, there's been a lot of state activity. It's been hodgepodge across the country. We've heard a little bit of that today. I wanted to give a brief overview of what's happening at the federal level. So obviously, because of what's going on with COVID-19, PFAS has been a little bit quiet at the federal level, but I don't expect that to last forever. EPA is making progress on its PFAS action plan that it released in 2018. They did, or 2019, I'm sorry, they did publish an update in February of this year detailing where they are and where they plan to go. So you can find that on EPA's website. But some updates of where EPA is at the moment. We know that EPA is working on their preliminary determination, which is the initial stages of a risk assessment. And they're doing this for biosolids, particularly looking at land application. And with everything going on and the delays because of COVID-19, likely we might see this at the end of the year, probably 2021 at the earliest. I also wanted to let you all know that EPA is also working on both aquatic life water quality criteria and human health water quality criteria. These are going to take some time. Obviously, there's a lot of data and analysis that goes into this, and it is likely that we're expecting proposals in 2021 and 2022. Now, there's a lot of moving pieces. Obviously, we still don't have a validated EPA methodology for wastewater. We're still working out some of this source control and pretreatment efforts. So there's still a lot of groundwork that needs to be done. As for activity on Capitol Hill, the House passed HR 535 in January of this year, and it included some language requiring EPA to establish a pretreatment standards and effluent limitations, and it set some pretty aggressive timelines. And also the House Bill 535 included some language that would automatically add PFAS to the list of toxic pollutants, which would automatically trigger CERCLA liability. So we heard from Jeff a little bit about the concerns of a CERCLA hazardous substance designation. So that was all in the House package passed in January. The Senate really did not have any appetite for dealing with some of the pieces in that House legislation. But as we sort of see the COVID issue kind of falling back a little bit, we are probably going to see more PFAS language coming up on Capitol Hill. We've already seen some language from the Senate. It largely mirrors what we saw in the House, minus the hazardous substance designation under CERCLA. So there's a lot of back and forth happening right now. We don't expect PFAS to go away. And especially this year with the Water Resources Development Act in the works. So stay tuned as for updates from Capitol Hill, from NACWA. And if you're curious about the considerations document, check that out on NACWA's website. So that's all I have. We can get to the Q&A.
Thank you, Emily. Yes, we'll take a look at some questions for our speakers, but first I just want to note quickly that Carla's colleague from the state of Michigan, Ann Tevelier, is joining in for the session, so you might hear her answer some of the questions. I'll start off with asking some of the questions. I know some of them were answered in the Q&A section, but I would like to repeat them so people can hear them. A number of questions came up during the first two talks by Carla and Stephen regarding specific test methods for PFOA, PFAS, and PFAS chemicals. Were they required, and what test methods were used for characterization? So perhaps Carla?
Sure. So since there is not still an EPA approved test method, we advised the communities to use, there's basically two sorts of methods out there, the ASTM D7979, which is often modified a bit. And then there's also the isotope dilution method, which is often called the EPA method 537 modified, or there's, various versions of that. And just, we advise them, like I think Kurt was talking about, picking a good lab that has a track record doing PFAS analysis. And we did, direct folks that they could look at the DOD website and see who had been accredited as a PFAS lab for the federal government.
Did you want to add anything, Steve, to that, or we can move on?
No, there's nothing to add. The only other thing is to just be careful. It's a little bit of the Wild West with the monitoring because, again, it's not a modification of the EPA method, but it's it's allowable modifications by the chemist. So the thing is, each individual chemist or analyst can kind of have their own variation. So the thing just is make sure you understand what's being done.
Okay, thanks. A few questions came up regarding the granulated activated carbon. What happens to it when it's spent, and how do facilities determine when the material is spent or breakthrough of the systems? I think it came up during Carla's talk.
Sure. I'll take a crack at that one. So that is kind of beyond my regulatory control, although we have advised folks that they should properly manage their waste. I know some facilities are having that waste incinerated. Sometimes it's landfilled, and I think there are companies that also talk about regenerating.
Okay, thanks. Do you know what types of treatment are used for landfill leachates?
The leachate that I know about being treated uses a GAC type treatment, although if there's a lot of other pollutants, it may require pretreatment. I don't know, Anne, if you wanted to comment on that as well.
Sure. So there's been a couple of landfills in Michigan that are looking into installing reverse osmosis or ion exchange treatment technologies. Again, they're just looking into, none of them have actually gone ahead and installed those. GACs does seem to be the main treatment that is being looked at for landfills.
All right, thank you. I'm just looking at some questions here. There was a question regarding actually taking samples and issues around contamination, collecting them for PFAS. Who collects samples from IUs, particularly in Michigan? Who paid for the sampling? And then I think you've already asked the question about methods used for sample analysis.
Right.
So
It really, oh.
Go ahead.
Say it really varied, and we left that up to the POTWs to decide. So some did their own sampling, some hired out from a contractor, some asked their industrial users to take the samples, and then the industrial user had the choice of whether they wanted to use their own staff or to hire a contractor. And we did issue guidance that on sampling that is on the MPART website. So there is wastewater sampling guidance as well as sampling guidance for biosolids and other media.
Right, and this is Steve Kaplicki. I was just going to add to, again, yeah, we've seen a variety of how people are collecting samples. There are some facilities that do their own. Most hire their laboratory to do the sample collection as well as analysis. We ourselves, for our industrial samples, we've trained our own staff to collect those samples. Again, you have to be very careful in the protocols in how you're handling the clothing you're wearing, etc., so that you don't have any cross-contamination, or at least you can minimize it. And again, the key thing here is you must include QA/QC sampling work aside from your analytical QA/QC in order to validate your sampling results.
Thank you. Another question, perhaps for Kurt or Steve. Do the platers know in their facility, what in their facility processes contain PFAS? The comments that a lot of safety data sheets do not include that information.
I'll take a shot at it first, and Kurt, you can follow up. I mean, that short answer is yes. They pretty much know what the materials are. For many of these, it's in the suppressant, so that's the starting point that you look at. Again, I think Carla mentioned it's predominantly not exclusive, but predominantly with people who have done hard chrome or chrome plating. There are some other metal plating where it has shown up. Sometimes it's because they've bought used equipment to install in their facility. They found that to be a source of contamination, but generally they know, and again, it's true with the SDS, it's not listed there, but if you see any kind of fluorinated compounds, you can guess that it's a PFAS material.
Do you have anything on that, Kurt?
Yeah, I would agree with Steve, especially when you're at a metal finisher, electroplater. They really know what's happening in their process and what chemicals they have used. We had one facility that, I mean, they had records, back 20, 30 years. So that was pretty enlightening. And some of these places, they have, process chemists that are there. So they really know what they're looking for, and they're not using the SDS sheet because it's really not going to say anything about PFAS on it.
Okay. Carrie, did you want to chime in?
This is Carla. Can I just add a little?
Yeah, Carla.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Steve and Kurt are exactly right. And I guess I just wanted to say, as far as, if a metal finisher used a fume suppressant in the past, it probably contained PFOS, if it was before the 2015 ban.
I have nothing to add.
Okay. Another question came up regarding how is the aviation fire foam material disposed?
Could you repeat that?
I'm sorry, the aviation firefighting foam disposal, how are facilities disposing of it?
Okay, let me try to answer that. First off, AFFF foam, it has some industrial applications in fire systems. It has extensive use with the airport. It also has, you'll find it in the local fire departments of many communities in Michigan here. The fire marshal has communicated with local municipalities to turn over for disposal their quantities of the AFFF foam. They're doing that. It so happens a lot of these materials are coming to the Detroit area to one of our waste handlers for stabilization. Essentially, they're stabilizing with concrete and sending it out to Idaho for burial. So that's one way. With respect to the, until the Department of Defense or the air regulators change their policies, AFFF is kind of here to stay, but they're trying to minimize their training usage, which has, they say, paid a lot of benefits, at least that we've observed so far.
Okay. One or two more questions here. About how much of the reductions in SIU concentrations were due to essentially just substituting products for those that did not contain PFAS or PFOA in these various users?
This is Carla. None really, because we started the IPP initiative in 2018, and all of the industrial users had really stopped using PFOS due to the September 2015 ban for chrome platers, and then PFAS containing products really aren't that available because of the EPA phase out. So it's really a legacy issue where if you ever used it, even if it was 5 or 10 years ago, we're still finding those residuals in the wastewater. So it still contaminated that factory. So
Okay.
even if they've replaced the chemical a long time ago, we're still finding it in the wastewater. So the reductions are really from current efforts to either clean or more likely to install pretreatment.
Okay, thank you. I think I better stop here with questions. Time's about time up. A lot of questions came through, so I'll let Cynthia talk about what will happen with the rest of them.
Thanks, Frank, and thank you to all of our speakers. Sorry we did run out of time there for more questions, but we will have access to those questions after the webinar. So we'll take a look at them along with the speakers and see if there's any that we can answer and send out that information to all of our participants later on. So we're unfortunately out of time today. I'd like to wrap up by showing you some of our upcoming conferences and events. Due to the difficulty in getting together in person right now, we do have some online events coming up, and you feel free to take a look at those on the NACWA website and see if you're interested in participating in any of those. As always, we welcome more members to NACWA. Feel free to take a look at that. The webpage there to look at NACWA membership is at the bottom of the slide. Again, you'll receive these slides and a link to the recording of the webinar tomorrow. And we'd like to thank you again to our speakers and our moderators for all of your time and effort. We hope that everybody's learned something today. And please take a look at the survey that'll come out in the email tomorrow too, and let us know your thoughts.